does magic influence a story and how it's built up to? See, magic is an interesting thing to use because it is a very fascinating storytelling technique. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, think about it. There are so many different techniques of storytelling in the world, but magic allows you to take those techniques and actually implement them in your story in a tangible way that the characters can interact with. A great example of this is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Now, Avatar: The Last Airbender typically uses what's referred to as a hard magic system. This means that it is a magic system with very distinct and firm rules. There are 4 elements. You can bend those 4 elements. There's one individual in this story who can bend more than one element, etc., etc., etc. And so when you take this hard magic system, there's not a lot of leeway to actually bend the rules, but you can bend them enough to be able to implement storytelling tools. Take, for example, Zuko and Iroh. In this story, there is a huge moral conflict within Zuko of who he is going to actually end up morally aligning with. Will he go with his father and his sister and reclaim the honor which he so desperately desires? Or will he listen to his uncle and eventually side with the Avatar in order to fully convince himself that there is a better way to do things and that honor and power are not as important or not what he expected them to be?
During the meeting, I was the perfect prince. The son my father wanted. But I wasn't me.
As he goes through this huge character arc, eventually Iroh sits him down and explains to him why it is important to learn from the different types of societies in this world.
Earth is the element of substance. The people of the Earth Kingdom are diverse and strong. It is important to draw wisdom from many different places. If we take it from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale.
He goes over the cultures, he goes over what's important to learn from them, and he goes over how learning from their magic systems will implement well into him. It is an incredible way of using a storytelling technique to show the lesson that Zuko needs to learn. He needs to learn how to actually accept other cultures. He needs to understand that the Fire Nation was not the great thing it was made out to be to him as a child, and it's the magic system which shows him this. And once he finally accepts this, suddenly his firebending is far more powerful. He has the ability to redirect lightning and finally stand up to his father. The magic system was there to give a tangible, realistic way of looking at the character growth Zuko went through. He learned to accept other cultures, he learned to accept that there was more to the world than what he thought, and as such, he was able to stand up to his father not only emotionally, but through bending. That is a great example of why magic is such an incredible way of actually telling a story, because it allows you to expand and interact with the characters on a different level. It allows you to actually introduce them to the storytelling techniques you want to use. And there are other ways of doing this too. Say you're playing a wild magic sorcerer in your campaign. Wild magic is known for being the most unpredictable of all of the sorcerer subtypes. In my mind, honestly, it is the most sorcerer of all sorcerers. Why is that? Because wild magic is just innately magic. While all other magic casters in the game have to learn how to cast magic. They have to learn, practice, and master it. Sorcerers just have it within them. And therefore it should be unpredictable because they've had no reason to actually know how to use that magic. It was already in them. They didn't have to actually embrace it. They didn't have to learn the lessons, and so they must do so as their magic gets more powerful, meaning it should be more unpredictable, meaning wild magic makes sense. And so take this wild magic sorcerer subclass and think about how you would actually use that in your story. You can use it as an example of somebody growing into themselves. Coming of age stories oftentimes align perfectly with stories of people trying to learn magic. Why do you think we had series that were so frequently set in magic high schools in the early 2000s? Because, well, on top of it just being a typical boom during that time, it is also a great allegory for coming of age. Learning who you are and learning the magic within you and finding a way to reconcile those with each other. And so if you're playing this wild magic sorcerer and you're trying to learn how to do things, you're trying to learn to embrace yourself, you're trying to embrace who you are as a person, the more control you have over your magic, the more your story is represented through that magic because your character is learning who they are. There's an amazing allegory with magic and learning how to embrace exactly what it is that you think your character needs to go through. Imogen in campaign 3 of Critical Role is a fascinating character because she uses the ability of telepathy to represent social anxiety and fear. She has the ability to read people's thoughts almost against her will. And so when she's in large crowds, things just get loud. And so she begins to become overwhelmed. She begins to become anxious. She shuts down. There's too much going on. She disassociates. She can't handle it. That is a very, very good allegory for social anxiety. It shows what she's going through. And honestly, you can use this in any sort of way, but you could also tell the story without magic, right? I could tell a story about somebody with social anxiety without the need for telepathy. So why use magic for these things? Well, it helps us understand. See, imagine you're somebody who doesn't have anxiety. And in fact, I have been a person who has not had anxiety and then learned later down in life that I developed it. It's not really important, but the point is, when people told me about anxiety before I had experienced it myself, it didn't make any sense. It was this thought in my head of, well, yeah, everybody gets anxious sometimes, everybody gets nervous, just push past it. Why is it so hard for you to just ignore it? That's really, really ignorant, but I didn't know that because I never experienced it. But magic allows us to take ourselves out of the story. It allows us to suspend our disbelief, which is a huge thing we need to do in order to understand a story. We have to be able to suspend disbelief to allow ourselves to say, sure, magic exists. I know magic doesn't actually exist. I'm aware of that fact. But in this story, I accept that it is. And so if I suspended my disbelief and I see somebody with telepathy struggling with all this social anxiety, it is easy for me to suddenly put myself in their shoes because I've already allowed myself to experience this. I've already allowed myself to push everything aside and say, yeah, for the sake of this story, let me experience it. And so in that way, it lets us understand more because we're already choosing to try and put ourselves in those shoes, to try and understand without having to comprehend what else could be going on in the world. And so once you watch that story and you understand that, and then you take a step back and maybe you're talking with somebody who has social anxiety and they say, yeah, you remember that person with telepathy where they heard all those thoughts? I don't hear all those thoughts, but that overwhelmingness that happened to them, that's kind of what happens to me. I begin to get shut down. I begin to disassociate. Everything's overwhelming to me. And suddenly, me, a person who didn't understand before, might be able to look at this and go, yeah, I get it. I mean, if I was experiencing all that input of emotion and constant dissonance, yeah, maybe I would also be unable to push past that. Magic is this amazing way of taking tangible story elements, tangible things that we can learn, and putting them into the story in a way the characters can directly interact with. It makes it much more punchy. How many times have we watched a story or an anime where we're waiting for somebody to be able to break through a barrier, finally be able to learn something new about them, and when they finally get to that point, when they finally accept a portion of themselves, suddenly a power-up happens. Suddenly their powers evolve. It is an incredible example of showing directly, viscerally, what this character has gone through, what they've achieved, and how they've grown past it up until this point. We get to see it on screen, and it is deeply satisfying. And so when we're putting this kind of stuff in our games and we're using this magic system, we can do the same thing. As we hit level ups and gain higher and higher level spells, we can embrace that magic and just feel powerful with it. We can feel like our character has achieved something and they have finally broken past their barriers and now they have access to the next level of spells. Now it's difficult to plan that out because a lot of the times we don't actually know when we're actually going to level up. We don't know the timing on that, so it can be really difficult to try and plan that. But as a dungeon master, observing when the characters are about to break through their molds, are finally about to have a breakthrough, and letting them level up at those times, I personally think that is a great way of handling it and allows us to use magic to tell a story on another level than we could have before. It's an incredible storytelling technique as long as you use it right, and I think that's fantastic.
A huge thank you to the YouTube members without which this video wouldn't have been possible.
An extra special shout out to BKBW, Corey Wood, Big D the Cool Guy, Ace Pizza Guy 22, Stormsaw, Emily Mares, and Agile Monk for subscribing at the Roll Slayer tier.